Back again? Right, as you wish to continue. What's the medical term for slicing off your own penis? How does that relate to the Oxford English Dictionary? Autopiotomy. The Oxford English Dictionary is the greatest work of reference ever written, and it's largely the result of a Scotsman who left school at 14 and a criminally insane American. The Scotsman was a former cowherd called James Murray, who taught himself Latin, German, Italian, ancient Greek, French, Anglo-Saxon, Russian, Tongan. Well, nobody's quite sure how many languages he knew. It's usually estimated at 25. Murray became a school teacher, and then in the 1860s he moved to London for his wife's health and became a member of the Philological, word-loving society. The Philological Society was trying to produce an English dictionary that would be more complete than any other. They eventually did a deal with the Oxford University Press, and James Murray, who at the time was still a teacher, became the editor. The idea of the Oxford English Dictionary was that it would trace the development of every word in the English language. Each word would then have its meanings defined in chronological order, with quotations given as evidence. Getting the quotations was a simple business. All that had to be done was to read every book ever written in English. Even Murray couldn't do that alone, so he advertised for volunteer readers, people who would fight their way through all the books that could be found, copying out significant-looking sentences. Now let's leave Murray there for a moment and turn our attention to the island of Sri Lanka in 1834. Where we'll find a missionary couple from New England who are trying to convert the island's pagan population to Jesus. He's called Eastman Minor. She's called Lucy Minor and has just given birth to a son, William Minor. The Minors were hyper-religious, and at a very early age they decided that little William was much too interested in girls. Maybe they were just being Puritan and repressive, but given the subsequent events, it's possible that they were onto something. Either way, the Minors decided that William's fascination with the opposite sex was A, a problem, and B, probably something to do with the Sri Lankans. So they packed their son off to a boarding school back in healthy cold shower that was 19th century America. There's no record of William Minor's sex life at boarding school, which is a blessed relief. All we know is that he ended up in Yale studying medicine. And that meant that when the American Civil War broke out, he signed up in the Union Army as a field surgeon. Being a doctor is a pleasant business in general. You cure people and that makes them happy, and even if you don't cure them, they're still reasonably grateful that you tried. However, Minor was assigned to the rather unhippocratic job of branding deserters. If a chap got caught running away from the Union Army, he'd have a big capital D branded on his cheek to inform everybody that he was a deserter and a coward. Minor was the man with the brand. At least one of the people he was forced to disfigure was an Irish immigrant, and in fact that will be important later. After the war, Minor was posted to New York, but he spent so much of his time in the company of prostitutes that the army got embarrassed and transferred him to Florida. It's a rather impressive feat to visit so many prostitutes that you become a scandal in New York. It's also an impressive feat to visit so many prostitutes that the army feels that you're overdoing it. William Minor's parents may just have been right. The next thing Minor did was to go utterly mad, and the army decided to discharge him completely. Minor moved to England to convalesce and settled in Lambeth in London, which was, coincidentally, full of prostitutes at the time. However, the prostitutes weren't the real problem. The real problem was the branding of the deserters, which still preyed on Minor's mind. One day Minor met an Irishman called George Merritt, and for no reason at all decided that Merritt was one of the men he had branded on a mission of revenge. Minor took out a gun and shot Merritt dead. This was unreasonable, as Merritt didn't have a D burned onto his cheek. It's also technically illegal. In the ensuing trial, it was decided that William Minor was absolutely bloody crazy, and he was confined in Broadmoor, the brand new asylum for the criminally insane. Broadmoor wasn't actually that bad a place. It was a hospital, not a prison, and Minor was rich enough to afford a manservant and all the books he could read. It was at Broadmoor that he came across Murray's advertisement for volunteer readers. Minor had a lot of time on his hands, and also the advantage of being criminally insane, which is always a plus in lexicography, so he started reading. He read and read and read and took note after note after note and sent the notes to Murray. He sent Murray hundreds of notes, and then he sent him thousands. Minor contributed so much to the Oxford English Dictionary that Murray would later say that the whole of the development of the modern English language from Tudor times to the present day could have been illustrated using only Minor's examples. But Minor never said who he was. He seems to have been rather embarrassed by the murder, and Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum is hardly the most fashionable address in England. All Minor's letters to Murray were signed W.C. Minor, Crowthorne, Berkshire, which was technically true, as Crowthorne is the nearest town to Broadmoor. It wasn't until the 1890s that James Murray discovered that his star contributor, the man on whom his dictionary was based, was an insane murderer. And when Murray did find out, he immediately set off to visit Minor, and the two became firm friends. They were rather different people, but by coincidence, they looked like brothers. They both had huge beards and flowing white hair, and both loved words. Murray tried to give Minor emotional support, but it didn't really work, as Minor, in 1902, deliberately sliced off his own penis. This is called autopiotomy, and should not be attempted without due consideration. Minor did have a good reason. He had decided during his confinement that his parents and the army were right, and all his troubles came down to his excessive sexual appetite. Minor may have been correct, but most men intent on curbing their sex drive would have the good sense to merely chop off their testicles, as the early Christian writer Origen did. The problem with an autopiotomy is that, among other things, it becomes difficult to pee. William Minor was in trouble and agony. Murray took up Minor's case, and in 1910 persuaded the Home Secretary to have Minor released and deported to America. Minor went back and died in his own country, but he took with him copies of the 6 volumes of the OED that had so far been completed, and whether these consoled him for the loss of his membrum virile, history does not record. Now, who was the Home Secretary who released Minor, and what weapon did he help to name? Water closets in Russia. William Minor was released on the orders of the Home Secretary, Winston Churchill. Churchill is remembered by lexicographers as a man of words. He wrote a novel called Savrola that appeared in 1899 to reviews that can be given the usual euphemism of mixed. He invented the phrases outre, social security, and V-sign. He invented the words seaplane, commando, and undefendable. He popularized crunch in the sense of the vital moment, and won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1953. With all these linguistic achievements, it's easy to forget that in his spare time Churchill was also a politician. As William Minor sailed, sans Willie, back to America, Europe was getting ready for war. In 1911, Winston Churchill was moved from the position of Home Secretary and became First Lord of the Admiralty, where he was in charge of developing new and more lethal methods of killing the enemy. One of the ideas that he oversaw was the land ship. The oceans of the world were, at the time, dominated by the Royal Navy. Britannia ruled the waves. Huge steam-powered gunships chuffed around the globe, making sure that the sun never set on the British Empire. These ships were covered in iron, so they were immune to enemy fire. And they had huge guns mounted on them so that they could destroy others. However, on land, Britain was not so invincible. The British army still consisted of men and horses, which are made of flesh rather than iron and could be killed in their millions. So, under Churchill's supervision, a plan was hatched to take the principle of the ironclad warship and apply it to land warfare. The British started to design the land ship, and it would be iron like a warship. It would be motorised like a warship, and it would have guns mounted on it like a warship. It would be a destroyer, but it would be used in the field and not in the sea. The idea was pushed forward by an officer called Ernest Swinton. Plans were drawn up, manufacturers approached, but everything was done in deadly secrecy. No mention of land ships was ever made in public, which is why they aren't called land ships today. The land ship was such a secret that not even the workers in the factory where they were built were to know what they were. By the outbreak of war in 1914, Russia was fighting on the Allied side, so Swinton decided that a good cover story for the new weapons would be to say on all documents that they were water carriers for Russia. But when Swinton told Churchill about his ruse, Churchill burst out laughing. Churchill pointed out that water carriers would be abbreviated to WCs, and that people would think they were manufacturing lavatories. So Swinton had a quick think and suggested changing the name to water tanks for Russia. Churchill could find no objection to this code name, and it stuck. Well, it didn't stick. Water tanks for Russia was a bit cumbersome, so the water got dropped. Then it turned out that the tanks weren't going to Russia after all. They were going to the trenches on the Western Front, so Russia got dropped too. And that's why tanks are called tanks. If Winston Churchill hadn't been so careful about lavatorial implications, they might have been called carriers. If Swinton hadn't been so careful, they would definitely have been land ships. The tank's a very useful weapon of war. But unfortunately, the Germans were even then building their own secret weapon, and theirs had a name that was quite ungentlemanly. Fat Gunhilda. While Britain was developing the tank, Germany was building a gun. To be precise, Germany was building an absolutely bloody enormous gun. It weighed 43 tons and could fire 1,800-pound shells 2.5 miles. Its official name was the L/12 42cm Type M Great Kurze Marine Kanone. But that's hardly the catchiest of names. So the designers at Krupp Armaments did a dastardly thing. They named it after their boss. The owner of the company was a fat woman called Bertha Krupp. So the engineers called their new gun Dick Bertha, which is German for Fat Bertha, or as it came to be known more alliteratively in English, Big Bertha. It's odd to give a cannon a girl's name. You hardly need to be a devoted disciple of Sigmund Freud to see a smidgen of phallic symbolism in a gun. However, history and Freud are at odds. For some reason, guns are always girls. During the Vietnam War, recruits into the US Marine Corps were required to give their rifles girls' names, usually the name of their sweetheart at home. But the practice is much older than that. The standard issue flintlock musket of the British Empire was called Brown Bess. And Rudyard Kipling joked that many men had been pierced to the heart by her charms. In Edinburgh Castle, there's a huge medieval cannon known as Mons Meg, which is probably named after James III of Scotland's wife, Margaret. And why do guns have girls' names? It's a silly question, because gun itself is a girl's name. So far as anybody can tell, and theories vary, the very first gun in history was a cannon in Windsor Castle. A document from the early 14th century mentions una magna ballista de cornu quae vocata domina Gunhilda, which means a large cannon from Cornwall, which is called Queen Gunhilda. Gunhilda is a girl's name, and the usual shortening of Gunhilda is Gunna. So far as etymology can tell, every gun in the English-speaking world is named after that one Gunna in Windsor Castle, the Queen Gunhilda. There actually was a Queen Gunhilda as well, but what did she have to do with smartphones? Queen Gunhilda and the gadgets. Gunhilda was the Queen of Denmark in the late 10th and early 11th century. She was married to Sven Forkbeard, and as is the way with Dark Age queens, that's all we really know about her. She was the mother of Canute the Great, or Me of the Waves, and presumably she helped her husband out with his beard every morning. She must also have known her father-in-law, King Harald I of Denmark, who lived from 935 to 986 AD. King Harald had blue teeth, or perhaps he had black teeth, nobody's quite sure, as the meaning of blau has changed over the years. His other great achievement was to unite the warring provinces of Denmark and Norway under a single king, himself. In 1996, a fellow called Jim Kardach developed a system that would allow mobile telephones to communicate with computers. After a hard day's engineering, Kardach relaxed by reading a historical novel called The Longships by Franz Gunnar Bengtsson. It's a book about Vikings and adventure and raping and pillaging and looting, and it's set during the reign of Harold Bluetooth. Jim Kardach felt he was doing the king's work. By getting computers to talk to telephones and vice versa, he was uniting the warring provinces of technology. So just for his own amusement, he gave the project the working title of Bluetooth. Bluetooth was never meant to be the actual name on the package. Blue teeth aren't a pleasant image, and it was up to the marketing men of Kardach's company to come up with something better. The marketing men did come up with something much blander and more saleable. They were going to call it the product Pan. Unfortunately, just as the new technology was about to be unveiled, they realized that Pan was already the trademark of another company. So as time was tight and the product needed to be launched, they reluctantly went with Kardach's nickname. And that's why it's called Bluetooth technology. Shell. The history of company names is strange and accidental, and filled with twists and tergiversations. For example, why is the largest energy company in the world called Shell? Well, the truth is that in Victorian England, seashells were popular. Really popular. Popular to the extent that just looks weird to us. Victorians collected seashells, painted seashells, and made things out of seashells. The devouring dustbin of time thankfully means that most of us have never and never will see a whole imitation bouquet of flowers made of nothing other than painted integuments of mortal mollusks. The word kitsch doesn't do it justice. These seashells had to be supplied by somebody. This is probably the reason why she sold seashells on the seashore. But the beaches of Britain were not sufficient for the obsessed Victorians, so lively trade started up importing bigger, shinier shells from all four corners of the earth. One man who cashed in on this importing business was Marcus Samuel, who set up shop in Houndsditch in East London and became a shell merchant. It was therefore perfectly natural that he should call his company Shell. Shell did well, and soon expanded into the other areas of the curio market, trinkets, brightly coloured pebbles and the like. Marcus Samuel brought his son, also called Marcus, into the family business and sent him off to Japan to buy gaudy trifles. It was while on this trip that Marcus Samuel Jr. realised that there might just possibly be a little bit of potential profit in, of all things, oil. Shell did not remain true to its roots. The seashell business on which the company was founded was dropped. Only the name survives. But the Shell logo that stands above all those petrol stations is a mute memorial to what was once the core of the business, and to the fact that oil was only an afterthought. in a nutshell. Shells are strewn all over the beaches of the English language. Artillery, for example, can shell a town on the basis that the earliest grenades looked like little nuts in their shells. It's difficult to get a nut out of its shell. It's also difficult to get money out of a debtor. That's why when you do manage it, you have made him shell out. Hamlet said that he could be bounded in a nutshell and count myself a king of infinite space, were it not that I have bad dreams. But that's not the origin of the phrase in a nutshell, which goes back to a deliciously unlikely story recounted by the Latin writer Pliny. Pliny was a Roman encyclopedist who tried to write down pretty much everything he'd ever heard. Some of his writings are an invaluable source of knowledge. Others are pretty hard to believe. For example, Pliny claimed that there was a copy of the Iliad so small that it could fit inside a walnut shell. The weirdest thing about that story is that it's probably true. In the early 18th century, the Bishop of Avranches in France decided to put Pliny to the test. He took a piece of paper that was 10.5 inches by 8.5. Normal paperback is about 8 inches by 5, and started copying out the Iliad in the smallest handwriting he could manage. He didn't copy the whole thing, but he fitted 80 verses into the first line. Therefore worked out that as the Iliad is 17,000 verses long, it would easily fit onto the piece of paper. He then folded the paper, sent for a walnut, and proved Pliny right, or at least feasible. The Iliad. The story of Troy, also called Iliam, hence Iliad, is magnificently grand. The heroes are more heroic than any that have fought since. The ladies are more beautiful, less chaste than all their successors, and the gods themselves lounge around in the background. Winston Churchill once observed that William Gladstone read Homer for fun, which I thought served him right. However, Homer's words are not really nearly as grand as they ought to be. If Ajax, the giant muscle-bound hero of the Greeks, had known that he would end up as a popular cleaning product, he might have committed suicide earlier. Hector, the proud hero of the Trojans, who would challenge anyone, even Achilles, to a fight, has ended up as a verb, to hector, meaning little more than to annoy with abusive shouting. Hector's sister, Cassandra, is now a byword for a moaning, doom-mongering party pooper. Even the great Trojan horse is now a rather irritating kind of computer virus, designed to steal your credit card details and Facebook login. And the phrases? There are very few famous phrases from the Iliad. There are a lot of famous lines about Troy. Is this the face that launched 1,000 ships and burnt the topless towers of Ilium? Sweet Helen, make me immortal with a kiss. But this is from Marlowe, not Homer. In fact, the only phrase that could be ascribed to Homer that most people know come from William Cullen Bryant's 1878 translation, where Agamemnon prays that he'll be able to kill Hector. May his fellow warriors, many a one, fall round him to the earth and bite the dust. Would Homer be proud that his only memorable line was a middling song by Queen? And the most famous phrase from the most famous Homeric hero isn't Homer's at all. It wasn't until more than 2 millennia after Homer's death that people started to talk about the Achilles tendon. The myth runs that because of his mother's magic, the only part of Achilles' body that could be wounded was the back of his ankle. Hence the expression Achilles' heel and the medical term Achilles tendon. The Trojan War, if it happened at all, happened in about 1250 BC. Homer, if he or she existed, probably scribbled his way to immortality in the 8th century before Jesus. Philip Verheyen wasn't born until 1648 in the unfortunately named Belgian town of Boring. And it was Philip Verheyen who named the Achilles tendon in the most unfortunate of circumstances. Verheyen was a very intelligent boy who started out as a cowherd, like the editor of the Oxford English Dictionary, but became an anatomist. Verheyen was one of the great dissectors, so when his own leg had to be amputated, he was partly a tragedy and partly a temptation. Verheyen was an ardent Christian who believed in the physical resurrection of the body. He therefore did not want his leg to be buried separately from the rest of him, as this would be a great inconvenience on the day of judgment. So he preserved it using chemicals, kept it with him at all times, and after a few years began to very carefully dissect his own leg. Carefully cutting up your own body is probably not good for the sanity. Verheyen started writing letters to his own leg, in which he recorded all his new findings. It's in these letters to a limb that we first find the term cauda Achilles, or Achilles tendon. Verheyen went mad before he died. A student of his recounted visiting him in the last year of his life. Verheyen was gazing out of the window of his study. Beside him, on a table, was every last tiny piece of his leg laid out and neatly labelled. The human body. The body, by virtue of proximity, is the source of at least 1,001 words and phrases. There's barely a part of you left that hasn't been made into some sort of verb. Most, like heading off or stomaching criticism, are obvious. Some are less so. Footing the bill, for example, is a strange phrase until you remember basic arithmetic. You compile a bill by writing down the various charges in a column and then working out the total, which you write at the foot of the column. At this point, you may find that you're paying through the nose, which seems a reference to the pain of a nosebleed. There are phrases based on parts of the body that you probably didn't know you had. The heartstrings, for example, on which people so often play and tug, are actual and vital parts of your heart. The medical name for them is cordae tendinae, and if anyone ever actually pulled on them, it would at least cause an arrhythmia and probably kill you. There are words that don't appear to have anything to do with the body, but do, like window, which was originally a wind eye, because you can look out through it like an eye in the days before glass, the wind could get in. There's more in your eye than meets the eye. For a start, there are apples. Every early anatomist thought that the centre of the eye was a solid that appeared to be shaped like an apple, hence the apple of your eye. These days, it has an even stranger name. It's called a pupil. And yes, that's the same sort of pupil you have in a school. In Latin, a little boy was called a pupus, and a little girl was called a pupa, which is also where we get pupae for baby insects. When we went to school, they became school pupils. Now gaze deeply into somebody's eyes. Anyone will do. What do you see? You ought to see a tiny reflection of yourself gazing back. This little version of you seems like a child, and that's why it's a pupil. But the part of your body that has the most words named after it is the hand. The 5 fingers. And there was yet a battle in Gath, where was a man of great stature, that had on every hand 6 fingers, on every foot 6 toes, 24 in number. The book of Samuel, chapter 2, or chapter 21, verse 20. Human beings count in tens. We say 21, 2, 3, etc. until we get to 29, then 30. Then we start again with 31, 2, 3, 4, till we get to another multiple of 10, and the process repeats. The reason we do this is that we have 5 fingers on each hand, making 10 in total. If the 3-fingered sloth could count, he'd probably do so in groups of 6. Counting on your fingers is such a natural thing to do that the word digit, which originally meant just finger, now means number as well. This also means that when information is stored in the form of numbers, it becomes digital. The Old English names for the fingers were much more fun than our own. The index finger was once the toucher, or toucher, because it was used for touching things. We call it the index finger, but not because we use it for running through the index of a book. Both indexes come from the Latin word indicare, because an index, whether it's in a book or on your hand, can indicate or point you in the right direction. It's the pointing finger. The boringly named middle finger was once called the fool's finger. The Romans called it digitus infamis, or infamous, obscenus, obscene, and impudicus, rude. This is because they invented the habit of sticking the middle finger up at people they didn't like. The Roman poet Martial once wrote an epigram that went, Rideto multum qui te sextile sinedum dixerit et digitum porigito medium, which translate extraordinarily loosely as, if you're called a poof, don't pause or linger, but laugh and show the chap your middle finger. The fourth finger has a strange anatomical property that gives it both its ancient and modern names, the leech finger and the ring finger. There's a vein that runs directly from the fourth finger to the heart, or at least that's what doctors used to believe. Nobody's quite sure why, as there isn't actually any such thing. Yet it was this belief that made the fourth finger vital in medieval medicine. Doctors reasoned that if this finger connected directly to the heart, then it was probably possible to use it as a proxy. You could cure heart disease and treat heart attacks simply by doing things to the fourth finger of the patient's hand. The medieval word for a doctor was a leech, and so this digit used to be known as the leech finger. Who'd be so silly as to believe anything like that nowadays? Well, anybody who's married. You see, we put the wedding ring on that finger precisely because of that non-existent vein. If the finger and the heart are that closely connected, then you can trap your lover's heart simply by encircling the finger with a gold ring. Hence, ring finger. And the little finger? Well, the Old English used to use that for scratching their ears, so they called it the ear finger. Hoax bodies. Let us finish our tour of the human body with the Latin word for the whole thing, corpus. It's pretty obvious how this word gave us corpse and corporal punishment. It's a lot less obvious how it gave us words for magic and fraud. To explain that, we'll have to go back to a certain supper that took place in Jerusalem in around 33 AD. And as they were eating, Jesus took bread and blessed it and brake it and gave it to his disciples and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." The book of Matthew, the Gospel according to St. Matthew, chapter 26, verse 26. Funny chap, Jesus. First, it's a little strange to assert the piece of bread is your body. If you or I tried that, we wouldn't be believed. We certainly wouldn't be allowed to run a bakery. Yet, given that Jesus was the Son of God, we'll just have to take him at his word. What's odd is the cannibalistic non sequitur. If Jesus had said, "Take, eat, this is plain old bread and not human flesh," then the sentence would make sense. As it is, Jesus tells his disciples, "This is not bread. This is human flesh. What's more, it's my flesh. Now eat it up, like good little cannibals." It's enough to make you curious. Christianity's cannibalism is something so central to Western culture that it often escapes our notice. During the Crusades, the Muslims got rather worried about it. Nobody was sure how far the Christian cannibalism went, and rumours spread around the Near East of Muslims being cooked and eaten. When the Christians tried to explain that they only ate God, they just seemed to be adding blasphemy to their sins. You were meant to take the cannibalism literally as well. At the time, a Christian could be burnt at the stake for denying the literal truth of transubstantiation, the communion wafer was actually turned into Jesus' flesh. All that remained of the original wafer were the theologians called the accidentals. The accidentals were those qualities that meant that the wafer still looked, smelled, felt and tasted like a wafer. Other than that, it was wholly transformed. And this change was effected by the priest taking the wafer and saying the magic words, "Hoc est corpus meum." This is my body. And in the 16th century, Protestantism happened. This new form of Christianity asserted, among other things, that the wafer did not turn into Jesus' flesh, but merely represented it. Rather than behaving like gentlemen agreeing to differ, the Protestants and Catholics got into an awful spat about whether the wafer was or wasn't the Lord's flesh, and did all sorts of things like burning each other, attaching each other to racks and making jokes at each other's expense. In the court of Protestant King James I, there was a clown who used to perform comical magic tricks, during which he would intone the cod magical words, "Hocus pocus." Indeed, the clown himself called himself His Majesty's Most Excellent Hocus Pocus. And the phrase caught on. And where did that come from? In all probability, says a 17th century sermon, those common juggling words of hocus pocus are nothing else but a corruption of hoc est corpus, by way of ridiculous imitation of the priests of the Church of Rome in their trick of transubstantiation. From the body to cannibalism to religion to magic, corpus has come a long way. But it still has a long way to go. Hocus pocus got shortened to hoax. The words of Jesus had been translated, parodied, shortened, and now they meant an outright barefaced con. And it didn't stop there. Hoax got changed again. Not shortened this time, but lengthened. Hoax became hokum, an American phrase meaning nonsense or rubbish or bunkum. In fact, it probably gained its cum in order to make it sound more like Buncombe. Now, does Buncombe relate to bunk beds, golfing bunkers, or reedy valleys? Bunking and debunking. It's awfully tempting to think that debunking has something to do with bunk beds. One imagines that a false idea is found snoozing under a duvet, is woken up, thrown out of his bunk bed by a big burly reason. And this is, alas, nonsense. Debunking is the process of getting rid of an idea that is bunk or bunkum. Buncombe, as we all know, is complete and utter nonsense. It's also a place in North Carolina. Buncombe County is in the west of the state, a rather pretty and rural area that became a byword for claptrap. In 1820, the Congress of the United States was debating the Missouri question. The Missouri question was to do with slavery, and the answer turned out to be the Missouri Compromise. Towards the end of the debate, a congressman called Felix Walker stood up, cleared his throat, began to speak, and wouldn't stop. He went on until people started to get fidgety, and on until people started to get annoyed, and on until people started to jeer, and on until people started to tap him on the shoulder and tell him to stop, and on until there was a small crowd round him demanding to know why he wouldn't stop. Felix Walker replied that he was not speaking to Congress. His speech was for the benefit of his constituency back home. He was making a speech for Buncombe. You see, Felix Walker didn't care about the Missouri question or the Missouri Compromise. He cared less about the press coverage he would get among the voters in his own constituency. That's what he cared about. It was such an ingenious idea, such a common practice in all democracies, that the phrase caught on. And speaking to Buncombe soon got shortened to speaking Buncombe, and then just plain Buncombe, which needed to be debunked. It's worth mentioning that though that's the usual story, there is an alternative version in which a congressman wandered in and found Felix Walker addressing an utterly empty chamber. He asked Walker what the hell he was doing, and Walker explained that he was speaking to Buncombe. No doubt a copy of the speech would be mailed home. I prefer this version, but it's less likely to be true. Either way, Buncombe remains talk that serves no actual purpose, and is definitely down to the place in North Carolina. Poor Buncombe County, consigned to the dictionary as a byword for nonsense. Edward Buncombe must be turning in his grave. Edward Buncombe was a British chap who was born in St. Kitts but moved to America when he inherited a great big plantation in Carolina. He was one of the first fellows in the area to join the pro-independence movement, and when the Revolutionary War broke out in 1775, he joined the Continental Army and was wounded at the Battle of Germantown. He would probably have recovered were it not that one night he got out of bed and sleepwalked to the top of a flight of stairs, toppled down and died from his reopened wounds. In his will, he left over 2,000 acres of plantation and 10 Negroes. He was such a hero that a few years later, Buncombe County was named in his honour. So really it's Edward Buncombe whose name is debunked. Or you can go further. Edward Buncombe must somehow or other have been a descendant of Richard de Buncombe, who lived in Somerset in the early 14th century. Buncombe itself means reedy, born, valley, combe. Combe is one of the very few words in Old English that comes from Celtic. Why there are so few is a great mystery. It all depends on how nasty the Anglo-Saxons were. The Anglo-Saxon mystery. Once upon a time, 2,000 years ago, the British Isles were inhabited by Celts, who, as you might expect, spoke Celtic languages. They also had tattoos. The ancient Greeks called the inhabitants of these foggy islands Britanoi, from where we get the name Britain, meaning tattooed people. Although this may have just been down to the Celtic habit of painting themselves with woad, which the Greeks thought rather odd. The important thing for the moment is that Bertha, who died in 61 AD, wasn't English, even though she lived in what is now England. England didn't exist at the time. Bertha was a Celtic Britain. England started to exist only when the Angles began arriving from Denmark in about 400 AD. They referred to their new country as Angleland, or England. Along with the Angles came the Saxons from Saxony and the Jutes from Jutland, and between them they started to speak Old English. Soon they had kings, and one of these was called Alfred the Great, who was originally the king of the West Saxons, but decided to call himself Rex Anglo-Saxonum, or King of the Anglo-Saxons. So what happened to the Celts? Well, what happened to all the people who swandered around the island before, covered in woad? The answer is that nobody's quite sure. There are two arguments, the linguistic one and the historical one. Whenever one bunch of people conquers another, they pick up a bit of the conquered people's language. You can't help it. Try as you might, the native language is all around you. You may have enslaved the natives, but you still need to be able to order your slaves around. You may not want to learn the language, but there are always new things in a new country that you don't have any words of your own to describe. Take the example of the British in India. The Brits were there only a couple of 100 years, and yet in that time they picked up shampoo, bungalow, juggernaut, mongoose, khaki, chutney, bangle, cushy, pundit, bandana, dinghy, etc., etc. Those are the only words that they brought home with them. Those were only the words they brought home with them. So what words did the Angles and Saxons pick up from the Celts? Next to nothing. There's combe, meaning valley, which comes from cum. There's tor, meaning rock, which comes from tor, the Celtic word for hill. There's cross, which we seem to have got from the Irish missionaries in the 10th century rather than from the native Celts. Well, there's not much else. It depends on how you count things, really, and it's always possible that words were there but not noted down. The Anglo-Saxons managed to occupy an island for hundreds of years and take almost no words from the people they defeated. In fact, linguistically, this doesn't look like an occupation. It looks like a massacre. On the surface, it would appear to be a pretty crazy massacre as well. Of course, massacres are always pretty bad things, but you'd still expect a few more words to have crept into Old English, even if they were only the words for ouch, no, stop it. In English, there's a terrifying absence. And the historians say that this is absolute hogwash. Where, they ask quite reasonably, are the bodies? There aren't any. No mass graves, no accounts of epic battles, no slaughter recorded, nothing archaeological, zero, zilch, nil. So where linguists see a slaughter, archaeologists see peaceful coexistence. It's all rather odd. Although there's a third possibility, which is illustrated by a hill in Herefordshire called Pensacs, and a town in Essex called Saffron Walden. Pensacs means hill, pen, of the Saxons. And very importantly, the pen there is a Celtic word. It would seem that, for a while at least, there were Saxons on the hill and Celts down in the valley. The same goes for the charmingly named Dorset village of Sixpenny Handley. Sixpenny is a corruption of sexpen and is just Pensacs with the elements swapped round. Meanwhile, Saffron Walden is obviously a place where they grew saffron, but the Walden is odd. It's an Anglo-Saxon term meaning literally Valley of the Foreigners, but well was a word that was always used to refer to Celts, and indeed it gave us the name Wales. So if you work from the place name evidence, you get a third and a very odd picture of a country filled with settlements of Anglo-Saxons and Celts living side by side, but never talking. And that would mean they weren't trading, weren't marrying, weren't doing anything except naming each other's settlements, presumably as places to avoid. You might theorise that each people understood the other's language and merely chose to speak their own pure dialect. But it would appear that this wasn't the case. Again, it comes down to place names. As we've seen, pen was a Celtic word for hill. Yet when the Old English came across a hill called Pen, they decided to name it Pen Hull, being the Old English word for hill. The same process was repeated all across England. Names were doubled up, such as Bredon, Hill, or the River Esk, River. This would seem to point to a linguistic exchange that didn't go much further than finding out a place name before driving out anybody who knew what the place name meant. It also makes for some very amusing etymologies. Penhull became Pendle, and then a few hundred years later somebody again noticed that it was a hill and changed the name to Pendle Hill, which means hill. And this was not a one-off. Breedon Hill in Worcestershire is also hill, on exactly the same pattern of Celtic, Bree, Old English, Don, and Modern English, hill. We'll never know how the Anglo-Saxons and the Celts really got on. Maybe it was a massacre. Maybe it was a jolly party. The ages were too dark and history is too forgetful. Nor is it wise to be consumed by sorrow or anger. If you look back far enough, everything is stolen and every country invaded. The Celts themselves had conquered the previous people of Britain in around 600 BC, and the Anglo-Saxons were about to get hit by the vicious Vikings, who'd bring with them their own language and their own place names. For example, one Viking found a sedge-covered stream in Yorkshire and decided to call it Sedge Stream, thus spawning one of the world's largest corporations.